Episode 61. Unbelievable.
May I know which one of you is Harvey?
The man who had just entered looked about 40 years old. His eyes were sharp, his clothes prim and proper. Harvey had been looking for Captain Gomez for days, but he refused to meet him. Now that he'd appeared suddenly, Harvey did not even have the time to think of what he was doing here. He stepped forward.
I am.
Samuel stood beside Michael and whispered,
Captain Gomez wasn't intending to bother us and asked us not to look into this matter too much. Why has he changed his mind now?
After thinking for a while, Samuel looked at Michael.
Michael, could he know you? No, that's not right. He wouldn't have heard you.
Samuel couldn't figure out the reason. Michael simply stared at Captain Gomez as if deep in thought.
157. Get the technology department to run a check on this number.
Michael said to Captain Gomez.
It probably isn't a prepaid card, but you can try tracing the communication route.
Captain Gomez nodded and got the young technical personnel to see to it.
Then, I'll need you to come up with a system. The person who handed Harvey the item was definitely in disguise, but you'd be able to find some clues. The camera at the entrance should have captured his face.
Michael went on instructing them. Captain Gomez quickly figured out that Michael was the leader amongst them. He took another look at him.
Roughly how long will it take you to get these done?
Michael looked up at the technical personnel. The technical personnel responded.
Half an hour. There are 4 plastic factories in Chicago. How long will it take you to find the precise locations?
Michael asked.
I haven't tried. Give me about 20 minutes.
Harvey understood that this would probably give them Marvin's address. He looked at the young technical personnel anxiously. Tension rose in the lounge. That was when a female voice yelling, "Victory!" came from Bessy's cell phone, breaking the tension. Harvey looked in her direction impatiently. Bessy lowered the volume of her cell phone. When she looked up, she saw Harvey's unpleasant expression directed at her. Who would play games at a time like this?
Miss, please don't disturb the technical personnel,
Harvey warned Bessy in a mellow voice. The technical personnel were trying to track down the location. But the location he found was exactly where they were at. Samuel widened his eyes.
How could this be? There's too much interference.
The technical personnel sounded serious.
It would take about a day to get everything figured out from scratch.
For such a huge project, a day was considered pretty fast.
But your case 712 was really fast.
Harvey looked straight at Captain Gomez and the technical personnel. Captain Gomez did not say a thing. Bessy kept her phone and stood up. Michael turned towards Bessy and handed the technical personnel laptop to her. He smiled and said, "For you." Bessy looked at Michael in surprise. She didn't expect Michael to hand her the laptop right away. Captain Gomez was a serious and cold person. Even after Harvey said so many words to him, he didn't utter a reply. Harvey learned of how cold the people in this team were in the past few days. Captain Gomez didn't even care about him, despite his persistence in the past few days. He finally appeared today, perhaps because Michael was here. Harvey was about to ask the technical personnel some questions. However, he saw Michael handing over the laptop to Bessy and frowned.
Michael, why are you giving the laptop to her? Don't hold up the programmer's work.
He then looked unhappily at Bessy, as if asking why wasn't she leaving yet. Samuel didn't react in time. He tilted his head and seemed deep in thought about Michael's intentions. Bessy looked at the laptop in Michael's hands and took it from him. Before she turned around, the technical personnel hurriedly stood up and made way for her. Bessy sat down and concentrated on her work. She pursed her lips as her slender fingers tapped away on the keyboard. Lines and lines of code that only programmers understood appeared on the screen. "Locate it," Bessy said nonchalantly. The surrounding atmosphere changed once she started concentrating. The technical staff, who was very cold to Harvey, heard her and took out a cell phone from his pocket. He flipped it open and clicked on a switch on the left side. It then immediately turned into a mini computer.
Locating.
The technical staff sat by her side and opened up the map. Following Bessy's instruction, he found an address in the north part of the city. Everyone saw how the technical personnel went through a ton of code and information during his testing. and still ended up with nothing. Not even 10 minutes had passed, and she'd found the location? What the heck? Who was she? Harvey's jaw dropped. He went from puzzled to surprised to numb. He thought he was hallucinating. Captain Gomez brought a cup of tea and placed it beside Bessy's right hand.
This is green tea. I have used 7 tea leaves. It's not too strong.
He then turned towards Harvey.
I've sent people to the abandoned factory in the north.
Harvey was completely speechless now. Samuel recovered from the initial surprise. However, he couldn't stop himself from looking at Bessy again and again.
Michael, you knew this all along?
Samuel finally found his voice again. Clenching his fists and placing it onto his lips, Michael coughed lightly.
I had prior suspicion, but only came to a conclusion now.
Michael felt like there was something wrong when traces of Bessy were found in 712. He then found out more from the cryptographic codes. He confirmed his suspicions when Captain Gomez suddenly appeared.
Captain Gomez shouldn't have heard of me before. From what you guys have told me, he didn't appear even after Harvey visited him so many times. That meant that he didn't want to be involved.
Samuel was puzzled.
But that's just a guess. After Captain Gomez came, his eyes kept shifting to her. This was his subconscious at play. From his expressions, he holds her in high regard.
712? Samuel was more puzzled. That was 3 years ago. How old is she? Michael didn't reply.
Heck, you guys are all crazy good at this.
After a long while, Samuel finally snapped back to his senses. He wiped his face and said emotionlessly, both the technical personnel and Captain Gomez, who were very cold to Harvey, gathered around Bessy. Samuel didn't want to interrupt, but didn't dare to talk to Michael as well. He could only pat Harvey on the shoulder.
Actually, Captain Gomez isn't so cold. Look at how enthusiastic he is to Bessy, bringing tea and water, treating her like her dad.
Harvey was speechless.
Say something.
Samuel shook his shoulders. He was choking in the silence. He would explode if no one talked to him. Harvey remained silent. What the heck was there to say? Marvin's address was out. Harvey looked at Bessy deeply and proceeded with Samuel to save Marvin. Bessy was surrounded by the people in the station. Michael stood at one side and saw how the technical personnel was looking at Bessy with admiration. The surrounding crowd was asking many questions, trapping her in. Samuel and Harvey had left. Michael tapped on his phone with his fingers and squinted at them. Those surrounding Bessy heard a soft voice.
Don't you have exam papers to finish?
Bessy felt a slight headache from the noise surrounding her. She couldn't think clearly. Michael's soft voice felt gentle to her ears. She identified it easily. Bessy's mind seemed to have found an answer as she rushed out from the surrounding crowd. She then said towards the crowd behind her, "That's right, I still have exam papers to finish. The teacher is waiting to check it." Bessy heaved a sigh of relief and mumbled, "Let's go back." Michael looked down at her. Seeing her relaxed expression, he chuckled lightly.
All right, let's go back.
Acting as if nothing had happened, he turned around and exited the doors nonchalantly. However, he intentionally slowed down. By the time Harvey and the others rescued Marvin, it was already 2 hours later, at 5 p.m. As Harvey and Samuel had to proceed for handover, Marvin didn't return with Samuel. Instead, he took Captain Gomez's car back to the school doctor's office. After arriving at the school doctor's office, he saw Harvey and Samuel coming after recording the data.
I thought I wouldn't see y'all for a couple more days,
Marvin said emotionally after seeing them.
How did Captain Gomez agree to help? And how did y'all find me? I asked Captain Gomez, but he didn't reply at all. He's such a distant person.
Marvin wanted to continue, but then, from the corner of his eyes, he saw Bessy getting a cup of water from the kitchen. He stopped and didn't continue in front of her. Bessy took a sip of water and glared at him. It did not bother her as she sat back in her chair and continued doing her practice papers casually, with one hand supporting her chin. Marvin glared at her and frowned. Looking at Harvey and Samuel, he whispered,
"Let's talk outside."
Before he could finish, Harvey cut him off emotionlessly.
There's no need for that. What? We don't have to talk outside or avoid her,
Harvey said while staring at Bessy.
She saved your life.
Marvin was speechless. He was quite emotional just now. He avoided Bessy whenever he spoke, but this time, he was silent. This time, Samuel completely ignored Marvin. He walked directly to Bessy's table and placed his hands on the table. He did not speak. Instead, he stared at her as if it was the first time he saw her. A moment later, Marvin looked at Harvey numbly. He felt as if there was something wrong with his ears.
Harvey, didn't you save me with Captain Gomez and the others? The situation was complicated. Your location was uncertain, and the technicians could not determine your specific location.
Harvey succinctly explained.
It was her computer that determined your location. Otherwise, you would not have been saved by now.
So, it was not wrong to say that Bessy saved Marvin.
All Captain Gomez's technicians could not figure out my location, and she's the one who did it in the end?
Marvin had a hard time summarizing the situation.
Yes.
Although he had experienced the situation and tried to recall what happened again, Harvey still found it hard to believe. He clenched his fist before saying,
It wasn't even half an hour.
Marvin stopped talking. Episode 62. Why was Captain Gomez cold as ice during lunch? The school doctor's office was silent. In the past, Marvin never paid much attention to Bessy. Now, he was dumbfounded and truly shocked. It was impossible that Harvey was joking.
But how could she know?
Marvin stiffly protested. Captain Gomez was famous in the industry because of the 712 cases they solved. His men were all elites, and it was clear from the strength of his technical team. Marvin was not the only one. Harvey and Samuel were also confused. In their eyes, Bessy was just an ordinary high school student. How was it possible that she knew this type of technology? The entire situation was not described, but Marvin could imagine the scene.
Bessy, you're too amazing.
Samuel finally found his voice. He slammed the table and excitedly exclaimed,
When did you learn to program? You're more skilled than the professional technicians.
In the past, Marvin was only polite to Bessy because he was fearful of Michael. As he was surrounded by extremely outstanding people from a young age, he cared little about Bessy and secretly looked down on her. However, after hearing Samuel's words, Marvin no longer ridiculed her. He only lowered his head to look at his hands. When he saw Bessy again, the look in his eyes differed completely from before. Bessy continued with her paper at the table. She was doing a chemistry paper. As his attitude towards Bessy changed, everyone in the school doctor's office became very interested in her. She was only a 12th grade student. Why was she so good at programming? They pretended to pass Bessy without noticing her, but inadvertently saw the paper she was doing. Unlike her expertise in software programming, her writing on the paper was not attractive. Her penmanship was like an elementary school student's. Her words were far apart, not framed well, and had no corners. In fact, on a closer look, only a few questions were right. Even Marvin and Harvey, who were very curious about her, had some difficulties understanding her.
What do you think? Isn't Bessy awesome?
As Samuel helped Marvin bandage his wound, he accidentally hurt him. Looking at them, Harvey could not help but burst into laughter while drinking ice water at the side. Bessy was sitting at the table inside and was separated from Samuel by a glass door. If they lowered their voices, Bessy could not hear their conversation. Michael took out his cell phone. Marvin paused before whispering in a voice that only the few people near him could hear. Thoughtfully, he said,
Michael, don't you think it's strange? Why would a high school student that knows nothing coincidentally know this? Isn't this just too much of a coincidence?
Michael was currently on a call with someone. Hearing Marvin's voice, he turned around slightly. His movements were always lazy, and he casually glanced at Marvin without care. He explained little, but slowly said,
3 days from now, there will be a lunch with Captain Gomez. If you have anything to say, you can bring it up then.
Although the truth was not what Marvin thought it was, Captain Gomez contributed greatly to the rescue. Lunch was a must. However,
Michael, has Captain Gomez agreed to the meal?
Marvin recalled that when he was in the car when he came back, Captain Gomez did not seem to care at all.
Judging from how they look, it doesn't seem like they are the kind of people who would eat with others.
Michael, Marvin, and several of them would definitely be restrained, and Captain Gomez also talked little. How awkward would the atmosphere be? Although this was what he thought, Marvin did not dare to say much. This time, he went to Chicago with Harvey because of 2 reasons. The first was because of Michael. The second was because of Captain Gomez. It was better to have this opportunity than none. 3 days later, at noon, Harvey and Marvin were the first to arrive at the lunch. Michael and Samuel were waiting for Bessy to be released from school and were not there yet. Michael had set a time that was just after Bessy's release from school. Marvin and Harvey arrived in advance out of basic respect for Michael and Captain Gomez.
She's really quite skilled, but will it be bad for her to come to this kind of business occasion?
Marvin held his teacup and glanced at the door. He said in a low voice to Harvey,
"What if Captain Gomez is unhappy about it?"
Marvin thought that a high school student like Bessy was not suitable to attend such an occasion. He initially thought that Harvey would agree with him. Unexpectedly, Harvey only quietly drank his tea. He seemed to be deep in thought. Before Marvin could say anything more, an attendant opened the door of their room and a few people walked in. When he looked up, he realized it was Captain Gomez. Marvin's expression was obviously shocked. He originally thought that Captain Gomez would arrive later than Michael. Generally, people who arrived at the lunch in advance did it either out of respect or because they wanted to chat with others. Seeing Captain Gomez's expressionless and quiet face, he did not seem like someone who would engage in a conversation.
"Captain Gomez, what sort of tea would you like?"
Marvin stood up and spoke first.
"No, thank you,"
Captain Gomez said concisely. He sat in the seat next to the door. The 2 technicians behind him also sat down. Everyone sat down in silence. Besides Captain Gomez, who asked the attendant to bring over another pot of tea, no one else had any intention of speaking. The atmosphere suddenly turned chilly. Marvin tried to ask Captain Gomez and his team a few questions, but Captain Gomez and his team only shook or nodded their heads, like ice cubes. Marvin felt extremely helpless. He thought he was not a sociable person, but he did not expect that there would be someone who spoke less than him. He lowered his head and sent a tweet to Harvey.
"Captain Gomez is so distant, I can't work with him at all."
Just when the atmosphere was about to turn from awkward to freezing, the door was pushed open again. The person who opened the door was Samuel. He touched his flashy earrings and leaned back to talk to the person behind him while opening the door.
"Michael."
Marvin and Harvey both stood up. Michael lowered his eyes and acknowledged them with a slightly nasal voice. He walked in with Bessy. Marvin was just about to sit down. However, he was shocked to see that Captain Gomez and the others had also stood up. One of those people, who was as cold as ice, wiped the remaining chairs. Someone pulled the chairs out. With a faint smile on his face, Captain Gomez poured a cup of tea and placed it in front of Bessy enthusiastically.
"You can drink this tea. I just asked the attendant to bring over a new pot."
Since Captain Gomez asked Bessy to try the tea, Bessy took a sip. Seeing that Captain Gomez was waiting for her response, she nodded slightly and said in a low voice, "It's okay." Captain Gomez sighed in relief and then sat down beside Bessy. Michael and Samuel had seen how Captain Gomez and his men showered Bessy with attention a few days ago. As such, Michael sat down calmly and indifferently. Even though Samuel had seen it, he continued to look at Captain Gomez and his men and sighed secretly in his heart. Since everyone had arrived, Samuel told the attendant to serve the food. Captain Gomez introduced the delicious dishes to Bessy in a low voice. He even ordered a large bowl of boiled meat slices for Bessy. Marvin was speechless. He stiffened. Wasn't the lunch going to be cold and awkward? In fact, those people in Captain Gomez's team kept giving toasts to Bessy. Looking at the lively atmosphere at the table, Michael leaned back in his chair. He had always been quiet and focused, and he slightly raised his eyebrows when he saw the scene. He stretched out his hand to knock the table and whispered something to the attendant. His hair drooped down the side as he lowered his head, and his hands that were placed on the table were long and slender. Within a few minutes, Juice replaced the wine beside Bessy's seat for the attendant. The boiled meat slices placed in front of her were moved to the opposite side. It startled Captain Gomez. He did not dare to look at Michael. At this time, he only looked in confusion. Only then did Michael pick up his fork, look up lazily, and explain.
She had a few stitches on her right hand and is recovering from a severe wound.
Something must have triggered Captain Gomez because he suddenly sprung up and looked at Bessy worriedly. Even his voice was raised.
How many stitches did you get? What happened to your hand?
The technicians that came with Captain Gomez also put down their forks and looked at Bessy solemnly. Bessy's fork was gone before it even touched the boiled meat slices. She put them aside and glanced at Captain Gomez speechlessly.
I'm fine. How can it be so easy to recover from a few stitches?
Captain Gomez rambled on. Bessy was annoyed. She did not wish to explain and showed him her hand. There was only a pink scar and traces of stitches on her hand, but it was enough to tell how bad the injury was in the past. Captain Gomez continued frowning. Bam! He did not ask Bessy anything, but slammed his fork on the table. He looked up at Michael, who was beside her, and asked nervously,
What condition is her hand in? Are there any side effects? Will there be any problems?
Michael nodded and said,
Her hand is healing now.
Bessy got out of the car some distance away from the school, and she was about to go to class. However, she did not expect to see a black BMW at the intersection of the school. 5 minutes later, Bessy sat in the passenger's seat. She leaned back in her chair and narrowed her eyes. She was relaxed, but tried to sound serious. When she opened her mouth, her voice sounded dry. What's the problem? Tell me. Grace sat in the back seat. After the chauffeur drove the car out of the school's gate, he promptly got out of the car.
I've already found out about what happened on Twitter. Don't be angry.
After that, she changed the subject and said in a soft voice,
Bessy, why didn't you tell your mother that you knew Mr. Grant? It was Mr. Grant who solved the problem on Twitter for you, right? After such an esteemed person helped you, did you invite him for a meal?
Episode 63. Kenneth is only interested in two things. Although Chicago was large, it housed many hidden talents. The Smith family appeared to be powerful on the surface, but in reality, it had a weak foundation. Many families were more impenetrable, and some even belonged to the capital. Grace also realized that in front of some families, there were some people in the Smith family that were not worthy of being mentioned, like Elise, who married into the Perez family in the capital. It's okay, I don't know Mr. Grant very well. Bessy unknowingly covered her knees and said with a heavy tone, How could you not know him well? He already helped you. Inviting him to a meal is a must. Grace said. Bessy immediately interrupted her. Remember when you did not pick me up when I called you 3 days ago? Mr. Grant sent me back. I think he simply feels that I'm pitiful because I don't even have his number. Considering Gerald's status in Chicago, he was extremely eye-catching. Anne only needed to mention something in passing to Mrs. Grant before Elise's attitude towards Grace completely changed. Unexpectedly, Bessy did not even have Gerald's number. Grace was very disappointed. If it were Anne instead of Bessy, they would know Gerald's number 3 years ago. She would not be like Bessy, who was so old yet ignorant and self-important. Bessy pinched her own fingers, pushed the door open, and got out of the car. The chauffeur parked the car at the turn, and there was an open space. Bessy just got out of the car. In front of her, a beautiful Ferrari supercar drove over and stopped at Bessy's feet. Bessy turned to the side to give way and did not think that the supercar was here for her. Just as she turned sideways, a man got off of the supercar. He was wearing a flamboyant pink shirt and had a light smile on his face. As he took off his sunglasses and swept the area, he saw Bessy standing at the roadside and his eyes lit up.
Miss Miller, do you remember me? I'm Antonio Gomez.
He acted friendly by waving his hand at Bessy and approached her.
We met last time at the clubhouse.
Bessy glanced at him with little care, and her expression was quite indifferent. Oh. After that, she turned around and wanted to walk back. Antonio did not expect Bessy to leave. He was startled and did not expect this reaction at all. He had met many women before. Most of the time, they would come closer once he stood by the car and waved at them. This was the first time he saw such an indifferent person. After recomposing himself, Antonio hurried over to Bessy again, with a smile on his face. Grace was quite disappointed in Bessy. She already gave her such an obvious reminder, but she refused to learn her lesson and was about to leave with flagging interest. Unexpectedly, another car stopped in front of Bessy. This car was not the same as the BMW she drove, but a supercar. From Grace's judgment, it was not cheap. Although many people in Chicago could buy this car, very few people bought it because few people were willing to spend so much money on such a car.
Bessy?
Grace pushed the car door open. She raised her voice and walked to Bessy's side.
Is this your friend?
Grace's eyes swept past the sports car quietly and fell on Antonio. He was attractive and looked distinguished. She knew many people in the circle but never heard of any family with the surname Gomez. Bessy put her hands in her pockets and nonchalantly walked around Antonio again as she made her way towards school. Lowering her head, she looked cold and impatient, yet delicate. She was like a flame that set people's hearts on fire. Antonio initially wanted to stop her, but after he saw her expression, he was stunned.
You are...
After verifying that she was a student of Bright Bow High School, Antonio was not in a hurry anymore and turned to talk to Grace.
I'm Bessy's mother.
Grace smiled. Bessy walked to English class by herself. The afternoon self-study period was not over yet. Just as she walked in, Kenneth was walking out. Bessy turned slightly to give way to him. Kenneth looked very indifferent and did not even raise his eyebrows. He went to the office to get the papers. There was a physics quiz once a week and the quizzes were getting harder and harder. When he arrived, Anne was also there to collect the physics papers and had not left the office. This physics paper is very hard. Anne slightly raised her hand, tucked her hair behind her ear and smiled. I only scored 81 marks. The last big question made me dumbfounded. 100 was the total marks of the physics paper. Kenneth glanced at her. His expression rarely changed, but this time it did.
Getting 80 marks and above is not bad already. We have similar scores.
Anne laughed, and she had regained her momentum. I'll be rehearsing for the school celebration program on Friday evening. She watched Kenneth collect the papers and pursed her lips as if she spoke casually. Kenneth had always liked to watch her play the violin, especially recently, since he really liked her new song. Anne kept him in anticipation and did not practice her violin in school recently. She assumed once he heard she was going to rehearse, he would definitely not miss out on this opportunity. After some thought, he nodded slightly.
Okay, I'll be there.
Mary was at her seat trying to do a physics problem. Beside her was a notebook that Bessy gave her. Recently, she liked to do the physics problems when she was free. Bessy sat in class and pulled out a book to read. Bessy, the celebration is next Monday and the rehearsal is Friday evening. Do you want to watch our rehearsal? Mary put down her pen and looked at Bessy hopefully. As Bessy flipped the pages of her book, she glanced at her and slowly responded, I'll think about it. She did not confirm her attendance nor reject her. Mary was quite happy about it. Bessy leaned back in her chair, placed her hand on her chin, narrowed her eyes and thought about it casually. Perhaps she should make some time on Friday night. Kenneth came back and gave out the physics papers. Their physics teacher rolled the papers up. On the way back, he talked to Anne and even discussed a physics question with her. He did not have time to look at his paper, but he had already estimated his score. He only opened his paper once he reached his class. The physics teacher had a habit of arranging the physics papers from the lowest to the highest scores. Naturally, the first one was Bessy's. Kenneth looked down and saw that he scored 38 marks. This time, the physics paper was difficult, and there were a few papers that had around 40 marks. 38 marks did not seem that jarring. However, this score could not help but stir Kenneth's emotions. He directly handed out the papers, starting with Bessy, and then continued with the rest. When the period bell rang, the self-study session was over and the students in the class moved around. Paul received his paper and went to compare it with Bessy's. But before he could make a comparison, he saw Kenneth coming over with Mary's paper quietly, with a strange expression. No one else knew, but Paul was very clear on this. Kenneth was only interested in two things. One was the violin. The second was physics. That was why he chose to be the representative of the physics class, even though his math was very good. Coincidentally, Anne was good at both. Looking at Kenneth's expression, he was a little startled.
Kenny, what's wrong?
Kenneth said nothing as he placed the paper on Mary's table. He glanced at Mary with cold eyes and hissed,
"You've scored 93 marks for physics."
He and Anne only scored a little above 80. Upon hearing Kenneth's words, everyone in the class gathered around him. The physics questions were tough. There were a few challenging questions spread throughout the paper, and those who could score 80 marks and above were those godly students who had taken part in the physics competition last year, not to mention the people who scored 90 marks and above. However, these people did not include Mary. Everyone knew Mary was good at languages and biology, but was bad at other subjects, especially math and physics. That was why she could never be in the top 5 in the class. Right now, she actually scored 10 marks higher than Kenneth. Even Paul, who had very poor grades, could not help but look at Mary incredulously. Mary was a little dumbfounded. She lowered her head and flipped through her paper. "I don't know." She felt she did the paper proficiently, but did not expect to only be wrong for a small subsection of the last killer question. Kenneth glanced at her, thought for a while, and asked politely,
"How did you do the last question? Can you let me see your paper?"
"Of course." When she handed her paper to Kenneth, Mary suddenly thought of something and turned around to look at Bessy. Bessy was lazily sitting on her seat, casually flipping through a book and sucking on a lollipop. Mary blinked as if suddenly remembering something. "I saw the last question in my notebook before." She passed the notebook Bessy gave her to Kenneth. Kenneth took it and opened it. On the first page, he saw 2 words scribbled on it. Although they were messy, Kenneth could still pick them out.
"Luke Song,"
Kenneth whispered word by word. Paul also turned around to inspect and then glanced at Mary.
"I've never heard of this person before. Is this person from our school?"
"No." Kenneth turned to the next page and was deep in thought as he scrutinized it.
"He's 1 year older than us."
He lifted his head to look at Mary with shining eyes.
"Do you know Luke Song?"
"No." Mary shook her head. Instinctively, she looked at Bessy and bit her lip. Without Bessy's approval, she did not dare to say anything to Kenneth. Kenneth followed her gaze and looked at Bessy. A ray of light flashed past his eyes, but it disappeared the next moment. He borrowed Mary's physics paper and went back to his seat. Paul did not notice this. He returned the paper to Bessy and went back to his seat. He then stretched his legs and noisily asked,
"Kenny, who is Luke Song?"
"The champion of IPHO last July. He's from Chicago," Kenneth softly said. IPHO stood for International Physics Olympiad. Kenneth thought about whether these 2 people just had the same name, but after flipping through the notebook, he felt that the probability was small.
"How did Mary get to know such a godly person?"
Paul was quite surprised. Kenneth said little, but he unknowingly glanced at Bessy. Episode 64. Do you understand what a violin is? Friday, noon. The scars on Bessy's hand gradually disappeared. Now, she was sitting in the school doctor's office and doing her homework. Marvin silently poured a glass of water for her and asked carefully,
"Miss Miller, do you want to eat something?"
He had a very respectful attitude. Although Marvin did not speak in the past or show his true feelings in front of Bessy, he was extremely dissatisfied with her deep inside. At this time, there was a clear difference in attitude. Bessy was sitting cross-legged. She turned over a page, lifted her pen to write something, and replied casually, "No." Marvin immediately stepped aside to avoid disturbing her. Because of the rehearsal program, there were no lessons in the afternoon. Bessy did school practices for 2 hours before packing her things. Michael half leaned on the sofa as he spoke to Samuel in a soft voice. Neither of them looked very pleasant. Bessy was doing her exercises at a table not far away from them. Today, she wore a school jacket and a red and black checkered t-shirt. She occasionally frowned but looked lively overall. Sometimes when they glanced at her, she seemed quite cheerful. This made the atmosphere of the school doctor's office very relaxed. Michael, who had been paying attention to this, squinted as he looked at her.
"Don't you have lessons this afternoon?"
"There's a rehearsal. Mary wants me to watch their performance." After packing her things, Bessy stood up. "It won't take too long. I'll be back in half an hour."
"Okay."
Only then did Michael nod and respond slowly. He leaned back again, and his eyes fell on her right hand.
"Don't do too much hard work for them. Even though your hand is fine, you need 2 weeks of rest."
Bessy did not turn back. She only waved in passing as she left. Samuel could not help but laugh.
"What a haughty girl."
Samuel paused, grabbed a pen, and looked at Michael again. After some thought, he asked again,
"Michael, Bessy could move her hand long ago. Why are you so worried?"
Marvin nodded ferociously in his heart. Not to mention, she was left-handed. Even if she was not left-handed, her scars were about to disappear soon. Michael glanced at the two of them with a calm expression. Even his tone was lax.
"Do you know why I am Michael and you two aren't?" "Why?"
the two of them asked instinctively.
"That's because your IQ is low."
Michael held the file holder with his long fingers and said politely. Both of them were speechless. Brightbow High School's hall. When Bessy entered the hall, she felt very tense, and her entire body felt like it was in low atmospheric pressure. Just as she was about to take out her phone to look for Mary, Paul patted her on the shoulder with his phone. As the hall was very noisy, he instinctively raised his voice.
"Mary and the others are still in the line. She asked me to take you to the small hall."
After knowing each other for a long time, he and Mary knew Bessy was afraid of noisy places. She would turn cold when there were too many people. A door separated the small hall. Under normal circumstances, there were few people inside. Anne was authorized to practice her violin in it. When Bessy went in, Anne was not practicing a new song, but her performance song. After listening to more new songs, Anne's performances had been dull for a long time. Kenneth listened to her seriously. When Bessy walked in, he subconsciously looked at her. Paul whispered to him, and Kenneth responded softly. He was now distracted and not paying as much attention to the violin as before. Anne's expression darkened as she had always been paying attention to Kenneth's reaction.
"Anne is not bad, and her playing is quite nice,"
Paul whispered in her ear. Bessy acknowledged him. "She's still on the amateur side, but she truly has potential." Anne heard Bessy and Paul's words just after she stopped and pursed her lips. Finally, she could no longer hold it in. "Do you understand what double harmonics is, or left-handed pizzicato? How about you two understand these terms before criticizing my playing? I don't need amateurs to evaluate my playing. Kenny, they are so noisy that I can't concentrate. Please ask them to leave immediately." Wasn't it just double harmonics and left-handed pizzicato? Didn't double harmonics mean the bow was floating on the surface of the strings instead of pressing down on them? The positions for the correct notes had to be precise to ensure that the notes were in tune and there was sufficient control over the string vibration. As for the left-handed pizzicato technique, it was more difficult than double harmonics. However, anyone who knew a bit about the violin knew of this technique. Did she have to take so much pride in knowing those terms? The key reasons Bessy said that were not these, but because Anne was not proficient in double harmonics and left-handed string pizzicato. Her double harmonics were very stiff and sometimes she went out of tune. In any case, Anne's foundation was solid, but her skills now were not good enough. However, Anne wanted to show off her skills in this piece of music, which caused its beauty to be ruined. That was the reason Bessy said her playing was not smooth. However, she did not say that out loud. She only took out her earpieces and stuffed them into her ears. She found a stool to sit down on, turned up the volume to the maximum, and her entire body relaxed slowly. Due to what Anne said, the atmosphere in the small hall became tense. Paul hid his careless expression, turned around and looked at Anne with a slight sneer. Anne did not dare to look at Paul. She dug her nails into the palm of her hand and slightly closed her eyes before speaking to Kenneth. "So, are you just going to let her be here?" Kenneth returned to his senses. He looked at Bessy with an intense gaze. After that, he turned over to talk to Anne.
As a violinist, you will be subjected to various comments by professionals and amateurs. You don't have to worry about them.
But what if I say that her being here is really affecting my mood? I'm unable to continue playing. Anne spoke lightly without looking at Bessy. Kenneth did not immediately answer. He thought for a moment about it. After that, he looked at Bessy with an obvious intention. Finally, Anne breathed a sigh of relief. She looked down from a platform at Bessy, who was sitting down. Paul opened his mouth, jumped up, and said incredulously,
"Kenny?"
Kenneth said nothing. The cell phone in Bessy's hand vibrated. Mary had called her, so she answered it. It was time for Mary's performance. Bessy stood up, took out her earpieces, and stuffed them in her pocket. Her eyes squinted as she said indifferently to Paul, "It's Mary's turn. Let's go." Paul looked at Anne with a slight smile, but his gaze was icy. After that, he followed Bessy and left the small hall. After the two of them left, the small hall was quiet again. Kenneth's expression changed little. He continued to look at Anne indifferently.
"They're gone. You can continue."
Just after Anne picked up her violin, Kenneth's voice rang again.
"Does your sister know how to play the violin?"
It was a question, but he said it in an affirmative tone. She learned it before when she was younger, but she wasn't serious. After a few years, she quit and even hit her teacher's child's head. Anne said. Kenneth nodded and said nothing else. His eyes were empty. Later, Anne noticed he was not listening as seriously as before. Outside, Bessy already saw Mary. She was behind the ones performing in the homeroom class. "What are you thinking about? The big troops are all gone." Bessy cleared her throat and softly whispered. "I seem to recognize someone familiar." Mary frowned. "I'm not very sure." Mary returned to her senses and took out a small glass bottle that was the size of her thumb. There was a small plant inside. She handed it to Bessy. "Take this."
"What?"
Paul turned over to look at them. Mary smiled breezily. "It's a blade of grass. Nothing much." After hearing Mary's explanation, Bessy looked at her expressionlessly. Paul cared little about Bessy's expression. He only looked at it seriously, realized that it really was a blade of grass, and said nothing more. Girls were really lame. At night, after Anne was done practicing, she went home with a lot of thoughts in her mind. Grace was on a call with someone at home and she looked thrilled. Anne sat on the sofa and did not practice her violin. She waited for Grace to be done with her phone call. She fixed her hair and casually said, "Mom, where did you find that piece of paper last time?" Grace hung up the phone and was startled.
"What piece of paper?"
Anne pursed her lips. "It's the piece of paper that dropped out when you were packing Grandma's stuff." Grace thought about it for a long time and only had a vague impression of it.
"Paper? It must be something that belonged to your grandma, right? I'm not sure. You can come with me to visit your grandma tomorrow and ask her."
Grandma Bertha? Anne did not know Grandma Bertha very well. However, the musicality and skill of this piece were very profound. Anne guessed that it probably had little to do with Grandma Bertha. She just did not know where she got it from. She nodded slightly. "I will visit Grandma with you tomorrow." Anne realized Kenneth was more interested in her adapted piece than her other pieces, but she only had one page of the music score. However, Anne did not associate the score with Grandma Bertha. She only tried her luck. The next day, Anne went to see Grandma Bertha with Grace.
"Mom, Anne is here to see you."
Grace shook Grandma Bertha awake from her bed. Grandma Bertha was very sick, and her mental state was not good. Even her voice was weak. Anne greeted Grandma Bertha with a few words of concern. In the end, just before they left, she covered Grandma Bertha with a blanket and said, "Oh, yes, Grandma. The last time when my mom helped you organize your luggage, I saw a piece of paper with many symbols on it." Anne was afraid that Grandma Bertha did not understand musical notations and phrased it differently. "Do you have more of it?" When Grandma Bertha spoke, she always seemed to be in a frail state and said little to Anne. However, when she heard this sentence, she looked refreshed, and her eyes lit up as she stared at her. "How did you know I had music notes in my luggage?" Episode 65. Spending Time with Grandma Bertha. Grandma Bertha looked sickly and wasn't imposing, but when she looked solemn, her eyes were strict and sharp. "Did you take it?" Anne's impression of Grandma Bertha was of a rural grandmother, so she didn't expect her to have such an aura. "I didn't." She couldn't help but shrink back, a little scared. "Really?" Grandma Bertha narrowed her turbid face and stared at Anne for a long time. "I advise you not to have any ideas about it, and you better not touch the music sheets." Anne felt a chill on her back. "Grandma, what are you talking about?" "You're very clear about what I'm talking about." Grandma Bertha coughed a few times. Outside, Grace was holding a kettle. When she came in, she saw how pale Anne's face was, as if she had suffered a blow, and she glanced at Grandma Bertha subconsciously. Grandma Bertha laid sickly in bed, her eyes slightly closed, looking exhausted. Grace was afraid of disturbing Bertha's rest, so she went out directly with Anne. Once the two of them were outside, Susan and Andrea came upstairs. Bessy held her phone and followed not far away. "Second cousin, you're here to see Grandma too." Susan walked forward and smiled at Anne. Anne greeted them and stayed silent. "Mom, second cousin is going to play the violin during our school celebration." Recently, almost everyone in school was excited about the school celebration, especially the group of freshmen, like Susan. Second cousin is even the finale performance. Recently, the school had mentioned Anne's violin more frequently, and everyone's attention had turned gradually to the most popular girl of science class, who was not only studious, had a good family background, and was also good-looking.
"Yeah, Anne has a celebration, but my mother's body isn't good, so I won't let her go. Do you guys have time? I'll let Anne take a few more tickets. She's in the student union."
At the mention of Anne, Grace's smile widened and her voice became a few pitches higher subconsciously. Andrea paused and said she still had work to do, but Susan said in surprise, "Then thank you, Aunt. Many people in our class don't have tickets." There were nearly 1,000 people in the 9th grade of Brightbow High School. Coupled with the parents and school teachers, the students only had a few tickets left. While they talked, Anne held her phone and headed towards the ward without raising her head. Grace stared at Bessy's back and didn't even want to nag at her anymore. She had always been like this since she was young, antisocial and rarely playing with others. Grandma Bertha had said she had matured earlier, but Grace was simply speechless. She clearly just had a low IQ and personality problems.
"Anne, go back first."
Grace thought of something and didn't go back with Anne. Anne nodded. Her heart was heavy, but she said nothing. Susan helped Anne press the elevator button. In the ward, Bessy sat on the stool and cut apples for Grandma Bertha. Grandma Bertha opened her eyes and leaned on the pillow behind her.
Bessy, did you bring back the music sheets I brought back for you last time?
It's in my box. Bessy lowered her head and cut the apples seriously. Her clean face tilted slightly, and she raised her eyebrow. Don't worry, I didn't throw it away.
Then keep it well.
Grandma Bertha smiled, then coughed again lightly. Bessy stared at Grandma Bertha and frowned. I originally wanted to throw it away anyway. It's garbage, but you still picked it up.
You treat it as rubbish, but someone still misses it.
Grandma Bertha raised her eyebrows, and when she saw Grace coming in, she stopped talking and asked Bessy about her studies. Bessy told her honestly about her physics results. Grace heard 30 points as soon as she came in. Grace wasn't clear about her other scores, but she remembered the physics score. Anne had told Thomas just a few days back. She heard that this physics exam was very difficult. Anne had gotten 82 points and was third in school. Even Thomas, who seldom talked, had praised Anne. Grace didn't speak when she heard Grandma Bertha praising her for improving, and didn't feel bothered. Bessy didn't have any other matters, so she accompanied Grandma Bertha for 3 hours every Saturday. Grace waited for her to leave before coming out with her.
Bessy, wait for me,
Grace called, her face as gentle as possible. Bessy reached out to press the elevator and narrowed her eyes, her face expressionless. What is it? Her attitude put Grace in a bad mood, but she still smiled patiently.
Do you remember that Mr. Gomez from last time?
Stop. Bessy could see Grace's thoughts at a glance. She stared at Grace, her eyes cold. You don't have to tell me who he is. I have nothing to do with him. Why don't you sell Anne instead? The elevator door opened with a ding. She went straight in. Grace reached out to block the door and pursed her lips.
I'm also doing it for you. That Mr. Gomez has a solid background, and I've also heard that he's the chairman of a corporation. You're considered lucky that he has taken a fancy on you. You should count your blessings.
Bessy laughed, her eyes cold. Since his qualification is so good, let Anne marry him.
What nonsense are you talking about? Your sister.
Grace opened her mouth. Anne had been molded by her personality and was comparable to all those noble ladies in all aspects. Furthermore, Elise also liked Anne, so Anne's marriage would definitely be in Evanston. After being in the high society, Grace knew that she was nothing more than a small wave in this circle. Although that Mr. Gomez was good, he was too dissolute and didn't have any personal achievements. He wasn't comparable to Thomas and Jacob, so Grace wasn't willing to let Anne marry this kind of person. But Bessy was different. She didn't have good grades, nor was she from a good family, and Grace really felt like she was quite ignorant of current affairs. If you can't explain yourself, then let it go. Bessy returned directly to the coffee shop. She had taken leave because of her hand injury previously. The boss wasn't usually so lenient towards the part-time workers, but Bessy was different. When she worked in the coffee shop, the business boomed several times more than usual, and the line snaked all the way to the streets. Be it from their own school or from another school, they were all there to see her face. So the coffee shop's boss was extremely happy to see Bessy.
Bessy went to the coffee shop again?
Samuel, who was sitting in the passenger seat, saw the grandeur of the coffee shop and couldn't help laughing. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw that Michael's expression was a little solemn. Samuel and the others already thought that Bessy's hand was fine. After all, the scar had faded. But Michael still didn't allow Bessy to do anything, nor did he let her enter the kitchen. All the tasks were handed to Marvin, and with his life savior around, Marvin did all the work earnestly. Michael had taken care of everything, only for her to run the coffee shop by herself.
Does she lack money?
Samuel thought for a while.
Should we hire Bessy as our technician? Her skills are definitely good.
Michael lowered his head and didn't speak. Marvin glanced at Samuel and was shocked. He didn't expect Samuel to trust Bessy so much that he actually wanted to hire her as an internal staff, without even going through a screening test.
He looked at Michael, and he seemed to actually be seriously considering it. Michael lowered his eyes, and his forehead drooped naturally. He squinted his dark eyes and wanted to go in and drag the girl out. He wanted to tell her there was no need to do this for money. But Michael said in low spirits,
"Let's go first."
Samuel and Marvin sensed his bad mood and didn't dare to say anything. In the Smith family's house, Grace went back and her mood was obviously not good. While having dinner, Anne came out and noticed that Grace was calling someone. She couldn't hear clearly, but she heard the words, Mr. Gomez. Anne's eyes glanced over and she probably knew something. Aunt Ruth served a bowl of fruits to Anne.
"Miss, this is the fruit that Sir just brought back. It's fresh. You should eat it first."
Anne ate one grape and looked towards Grace. "Who's my mother calling?" Aunt Ruth smiled and didn't seem bothered.
"She called him for your sister. A young man called Mr. Gomez has taken a fancy to her."
"Chicago?" Anne's eyes rolled and she pursed her lips. "I've never heard of anyone with the surname Gomez in Chicago."
"This kind of small family can't be compared to the Grant family, but for your sister, it is indeed rare,"
Aunt Ruth said. Anne naturally knew this. If this Mr. Gomez was from a big family, she definitely wouldn't pull her strings. It's indeed rare. From Anne's current perspective, Bessy wouldn't have any development in the future. Although Paul was close to her, how could the Addams family possibly take a rural girl as their daughter-in-law? She was considered lucky to be able to marry into the Gomez family. Anne wasn't concerned about Bessy's matter anymore. Until the evening when David came back and he suddenly mentioned Bessy.
"Bessy knows Chairwoman Grant?"
David glanced at Grace. Grace was stunned.
"Who is Chairwoman Grant?" "She's the chairwoman of the Grant Corporation."
Thomas picked up a piece of vegetable and explained.
"She's the younger sister of Gerald Grant. They're both in politics and business, and their main business is in Evanston. Their business is very big and out of the ordinary."
Anne raised her head at the mention of Bessy. She was in disbelief. Then sister knows Chairwoman Grant? She and Grace didn't know. However, her family was in Evanston, and she was also Gerald Grant's sister, so how could she and Grace have gotten in touch with her?
"I heard Chairwoman Grant mention it at a banquet today. Chairwoman Grant was inquiring for her son."
David also paused and then said,
"Her son is more low-key and follows his father's surname, Gomez."
Bam! The fork in Anne's hand fell on the table. Anne's reaction was a little too big. David thought she was a little strange.
"Anne?"
Anne immediately picked up her fork and smiled absent-mindedly. "I didn't expect Uncle Grant to have a sister, so I was just a little surprised." She also never imagined that the Mr. Gomez, whom she thought was unremarkable, actually had such a relationship with Gerald Grant. Looking at Thomas and David's expressions, this Mr. Gomez's identity was probably comparable to Jacob. Anne felt very confused. Why was Bessy's luck always so good? Episode 66. The difference between Bessy and Anne.
"Chairwoman Grant is a career woman,"
Thomas said quietly.
"Her son has settled down in Chicago with his father. You've probably seen him before. He's Antonio Gomez."
Anne glanced over at Grace, who was frozen on her chair. At the mention of this, Thomas frowned and lowered his fork.
"Dad, Chairwoman Grant was asking about Bessy for her son?"
David nodded slightly and understood Thomas's concern.
"I know how to deal with this matter. You don't have to worry."
The people at the table were all distracted. David could see that Grace was acting a little strange. After dinner, he got up and said solemnly to Grace,
"Come to the study with me."
Anne returned to the music room after dinner. However, she was distracted by Antonio Gomez's matter and felt a little angry. When she'd thought that she had never heard of the surname Gomez in Chicago before, she hadn't meddled with the affairs. Who knew that this random person would actually be related to Gerald Grant? And he seemed to be from Evanston. She was very upset and vexed. How was Bessy so lucky to be able to randomly find a low-key Mr. Gomez whose identity was also comparable to Jacob. Anne was sullen and also unspeakably jealous. The phone in her pocket rang. She looked down at the phone number, and it wasn't from the city. "Hello, Dad?" Anne frowned, but her voice was obedient. "You're coming to Chicago in 2 days and want to see me? Okay, I'll see you in our usual spot." Then she hung up. Michael invited Captain Gomez over for dinner. He had come to Chicago with a mission. Although Captain Gomez was arrogant and cold, he had probably been warned by some people before coming, for his attitude towards Michael was rather good. Even though he didn't speak much, there was obvious respect in his tone. But Michael sat on the chair lazily without a word. His lowered eyebrows were thick and heavy and looked very gentle but imposing. Captain Gomez didn't dare to take the initiative to talk to him. Samuel was the one communicating with Captain Gomez. Harvey sat with Marvin at the side and waited for Samuel to finish talking before Marvin spoke to Captain Gomez.
"Captain Gomez, did you know Miss Miller before?"
Captain Gomez had always been cold and often ignored people, but his eyes lit up at the mention of Bessy.
"Yes,"
he said concisely, but at least he didn't ignore him. Marvin was overwhelmed.
"Do you know what Miss Miller likes? What are her hobbies?"
He asked several questions in a row. He had thought that Captain Gomez would only answer with a few casual words or ignore him directly because he had experienced Captain Gomez's coldness before. He didn't expect Captain Gomez to answer him very carefully.
"Miss Miller likes quiet places. She seems rather cold, but is actually a very nice person. She likes to eat."
Captain Gomez was extremely eloquent at the mention of Bessy. He seemed like an old mother of hers. Marvin took out a notebook he always carried and noted down everything that Captain Gomez said. After dinner, Michael should have left, but when he heard these two people talking, he sat down, leaned on the back of the chair, and narrowed his eyes. He tapped his slender fingers on the table distractedly, seeming to listen very intently. Samuel was about to go, but when he saw Michael sit down again, he raised an eyebrow and sat down with a smile. Captain Gomez finally stopped talking and seemed to like Marvin a little more. Before he left, he specially greeted Marvin. Marvin really felt flattered.
"Why did you ask about Bessy from Captain Gomez?"
Harvey was very suspicious. After all, Marvin was like him before and didn't like Bessy very much. And Marvin was just like his name, so boring and moody. Besides Michael and his goddess, Harvey had never seen Marvin so concerned about anyone else. Many people in Evanston had tried to curry favor with him, to no avail. But he was actually asking about Bessy's preferences.
"Miss Miller is my life savior."
Marvin followed behind Michael and muttered. Marvin didn't like to express himself much, but he wasn't stupid. He could naturally tell Michael and Samuel's favor towards Bessy. Harvey took out the cigarette in his mouth and leaned towards Marvin, laughing.
"You're so concerned about her. Then what about your goddess?"
Marvin didn't even think before answering naturally.
"My goddess is naturally the first."
On Monday, the whole school was on holiday and the celebration started at 2 in the afternoon. Bessy crouched in the school doctor's office in the morning. The school was so chaotic that Samuel and the others all knew about it.
"Bessy, are you all celebrating today?"
Samuel was on holiday today and didn't wear a white coat. He wore a casual t-shirt and was lying on Bessy's desk as he asked with a smile. Bessy supported her chin with one hand and replied lazily, "Yes."
"Then what is your program?"
Samuel wasn't interested in what the other kids were doing, and he didn't even look at the concert tickets that some people had given him. But he would be interested if Bessy was to perform a chorus or anything of the sort. "No." Bessy picked up the milk on the side, poked a straw and took a sip. "I'm just going to watch my class perform a chorus." Samuel wasn't surprised. After all, with Bessy's personality, she didn't seem too likely to join the chorus. She usually frowned when there were too many people, and her brain would probably explode if she had to sing along in a chorus.
"Give me a message when you finish reading."
Michael slowly turned a piece of paper and raised his eyes.
Let's go eat dinner tonight. Captain Gomez is treating us.
Last time, Marvin and the others had treated Captain Gomez, so this time, Captain Gomez wanted to treat Bessy and Michael. Bessy responded and didn't expect a good meal. No matter where it was, it would just be boiled cabbage. The course is in the back court. You can come out at 5 o'clock. Bessy was expressionless. Contact me then. After lunch, it was 2 o'clock. Paul gave Bessy a phone call outside the school gate. Then I'll go first. Bessy put down her pen and kept her exercise book. Samuel greeted Paul very enthusiastically. Michael didn't look like he was about to greet him, and he just looked up and glanced at Paul. He was also concise to Bessy and said, "Yeah." Bessy took her headphones and went out. Michael glanced at Paul in the school doctor's office. Although Paul was talking to Bessy, it was obvious that he was 2 steps behind her. He looked away. Outside the door of the school doctor's office, Paul was a little afraid.
You know the people in the school doctor's office?
Paul asked in a low voice. With the sun above his head, Bessy put on a peaked cap and said lazily, "Yeah, I'm a part-timer there."
So you're not that familiar with them?
Paul sighed in relief.
Anyway, you shouldn't get too close to the people in the school doctor's office. Kenny told me that they... Anyway, just don't get too close.
The original words of Kenneth to Paul was to stray far away from the people in the school doctor's office, or he might die an unknown death. When Paul had asked again, Kenneth wouldn't say anything, but this didn't hinder Paul's conjecture. He knew Kenneth's identity. Bessy pressed her hat down and said perfunctorily, "Oh." Paul still wanted to talk, but they met Mary and Riley, and he quickly closed his mouth. A shaded place in school.
Anne, I have to work later, and I'm returning to Fairfield tomorrow.
James Miller took out a wad of money from his pocket.
This is pocket money for you. Keep it.
James had always liked this obedient daughter. Although he now had a young son, he was still as concerned about Anne, or he wouldn't have wanted to bring her back. He worked at a log factory and smelled of wood chips. He was sweaty all over. Anne naturally didn't want it and said softly, "Dad, this is your hard-earned money. How could I keep it? I don't need pocket money in the Smith family anyway. You should give it to my brother and aunt." James always found an opportunity to visit Anne every year, and she never kept the money he gave her and would ask him to give it to her brother. James always felt like this daughter was so sweet and considerate. He would find a chance to see Anne whenever he was in Chicago. Not far away, a group of people was talking. James turned around quickly.
Sure, you have a performance, right? Go on now.
He also didn't want Anne's classmates to know that she had a father like him. Anne said a few intimate words and heard that the group of people was approaching, so she turned and left. James stared at her back and was very happy at the thought that she was going to perform on stage later. He turned and walked towards the road, but then he saw Bessy in the crowd. Bessy's personality was quite like his, a little unsociable. James hadn't seen Bessy for a long time and suddenly reacted after seeing her that she had already come to Chicago with Grace.
Bessy.
He looked at her with some joy. He had wanted to say hello but found that several people were around Bessy. The clothes on the teenager's body beside her were valuable at a glance, and the other people around her were also bright and neat. Everyone seemed happy and excited. James reacted suddenly and immediately swallowed his words. Then he turned and walked into the woods. Bessy naturally saw James and was stunned by his reaction. "Dad, why did you run away when you saw me?" It shocked James that Bessy had called him Dad so naturally. His back suddenly stiffened. Stunned, he stood there and didn't dare to look back. Sweat slid down his forehead and even brought some fine dust.
Bessy, leave quickly. I will come to see you later.
Bessy took 2 steps forward, and when she saw James's expression, she narrowed her eyes and smiled angrily. "You met Anne just now?" James didn't reply and just looked panicked and embarrassed. Bessy already knew without his reply. She tucked her phone into her pocket, turned her head to the side and smiled angrily. "She's the same as Grace, equally impressive."
Bessy.
James looked at the dust on his body. and pursed his lips. Episode 67. This is My Dad. Chicago differed from Fairfield. James had seen many rich people in Chicago, and everyone in Bright Bow High School seemed to have good family backgrounds. James also knew what his presence would bring to his daughter, so he subconsciously wanted to escape. Bessy wasn't bothered. She lifted her chin slightly and said to Paul and the rest, "This is my dad." She was facing James with a cap on her head. Because of the light against her, James couldn't see her expression clearly, but he could hear the coldness in her voice. James froze directly. A drop of sweat fell from his forehead, and he completely forgot how to react. Everything in front of his eyes slowed down, and there was only the girl's indifferent but clear sentence ringing in his ears. My dad. The originally noisy school campus was suddenly quiet. Paul and Mary didn't expect this scene. Although James was a little tanned, his eyes were very similar to Bessy's.
"Oh, it's Uncle."
Paul stood upright immediately and greeted James respectfully and politely. He straightened his clothes and seemed quite helpless.
"I'm Bessy's classmate, Paul."
Mary also blushed. "Uncle, I'm Bessy's classmate. You can call me Mary." "Uncle, I'm Riley Pete." "Uncle." James was a little surprised at being called Uncle. He responded lightly again and again. "Uncle, this is your first time here, right? We can bring you around the campus. By the way, have you eaten?" Mary was very enthusiastic. James nodded stiffly. "There's a performance for today's celebration." Mary thought about it and then looked at Paul. "Mr. Adams, I'm not from the student union and I don't have a ticket. Do you still have any?" Paul waved his hand.
"Just come with us, Uncle. I'll definitely get you a ticket. Bessy, what do you think?"
Bessy pressed her hat down further and frowned lightly, indifferent. "You can ask him." Paul looked at James earnestly again. Paul was well-dressed, and the others even called him Mr. Adams. When asked by him, James was really at a loss.
"Oh, no, I'm leaving after I've seen Bessy. I still have matters to attend to and can't be away for too long."
"You're not looking around?" Bessy put her hands in her pockets, raised an eyebrow at him and nodded. "Okay, then I'll send you away." When James was sent out by Bessy and the other people, he felt like his whole body was floating. Paul was especially extra careful and even asked people to buy 2 bottles of iced water for him. James took the 2 bottles of water and got on the bus. His phone rang. It was Anne, probably calling to ask if he had gotten on the bus. James didn't look at it and just looked at Bessy and the others' backs as the bus left, his eyes a little sour. The celebration was crowded. Bessy, Paul, and the others scanned their tickets and went in. They could hear in the beginning, but in the end, there were more people talking and they could only hear their incessant chatter. The air was stuffy and dry. The chorus of English class was the second last performance, so Mary went backstage to prepare. Bessy followed her to get a breath of air.
"Anne, don't be nervous about the performance later. I'll be watching from the auditorium."
Grace's soft voice sounded from the mirror opposite.
"I'll record a video for you later and then send it to your father, brother, and your aunt."
Anne responded softly. Boom! An ear-piercing sound. Anne and Grace noticed. "This is the backstage. Random people can't just enter." The baby face beside Anne glanced at Bessy. "How did you get in?" Grace also saw Bessy and pursed her lips. She was about to say something, but swallowed her words instead. She was thinking of something. Anne was busy with her violin and only glanced at Bessy and then looked away. She seemed quite disdainful and didn't pay any attention to Bessy. Bessy slowly plugged her headphones in her ears, ignored everyone, and left. Paul was waiting for her outside. The performance was Mary's chorus. The song for the chorus was ancient, and Bessy was prepared to leave after listening to it. Everyone in the auditorium was basically waiting for Anne's final performance and didn't leave, so it was just right to leave now.
"We'll have a celebration later. Aren't you coming?"
Paul had paid attention to Bessy and could see that she was leaving, so he couldn't help but ask. Bessy took out her headphones and saw Anne pick up her violin and head up to the stage. Screams and applause sounded. Bessy's eyebrows throbbed, and she held the pendant that Mary had given her on her neck. She didn't speak and waved at Paul, with her back turned to him. Then she took a deep breath and passed through the crowd. It was just 5 o'clock. She took out her phone with her left hand and very skillfully pressed a number and called Michael. Grace came out of the backstage and returned to her seat. She had a special invitation seat in the second row. The position was excellent, and the video she took was naturally very clear. For Anne's final performance, the school naturally gave her a special treatment. All the lights in the auditorium were turned off and only a spotlight hit her. Her dress wasn't the jacket that the school usually arranged, but a dress that Grace had specially tailored for her. Anne bowed, then sat down and started playing the violin. There was almost no sound in the auditorium, and the reporter's camera was also aimed at her. Anne played a few notes and smiled. Suddenly, there was a sharp voice. Anne bowed her head stiffly and saw that a string had broken on her violin. Her mind went blank. This was a school-wide occasion. Even she didn't expect to make such a big mistake on such an occasion. The auditorium was also silent. Then, there was a burst of noise. Anne could hear someone whistling. The headlights were turned on, one by one. Anne looked up in a daze. The audience was whispering to one another and looking at her from time to time. Anne had never felt so ashamed before. The host went on stage to save the scene, and the program was cancelled. Anne had always done a good job as a prestigious lady in Chicago and had never made any mistake before. But today? Backstage, some people looked at her strangely. Anne's hands were shaking. "Chairman." The back door was pushed open and Kenneth entered. He glanced at the violin set aside by Anne and then asked heavily, "What happened? Why did the strings break?" Anne's chest undulated and she didn't speak. The baby face next to her was filled with indignation. Anne's violin is customized. How could it be so easily broken? Someone must have done it deliberately. Deliberately? Kenneth glanced at her. "Do you know who?" "It must be Bessy from English class." The babyface answered without thinking. "Anne has always been very popular, but Bessy doesn't like her. She happened to be backstage just now, and I was thinking it was strange. Why did she come backstage when she didn't have a program?" Kenneth narrowed his eyes. "Was there anyone else backstage? Let's check the CCTV." Anne pinched her palm and cleared her throat. "All of you can go out." Everyone else went out. They left Kenneth and her alone in the room. She had just made a big mistake in front of the entire school. She knew without thinking that rumors about her would spread soon. Anne sneered with red eyes and said slowly, "Kenny, you and Paul are always protecting Bessy, and I have no problem about that. But you also know how important the violin is to me. The backstage is such an important place. Both you and Paul closed one eye when she came in. But now, my violin has broken and ruined my performance. Have you ever thought that I would lose my face in front of the entire school because of her?" Kenneth was silent for a while. Then he said, "She has no reason to do this." Anne closed her eyes and seemed exhausted. "No reason? How do you know that? When my mom brought me to the Smith family and not her, she has always hated me out of jealousy. Isn't that reason enough?" There was silence in the room. Kenneth didn't speak. He took out his phone and called Paul. "I don't have Bessy's phone number. Tell her to come backstage." Anne stood there in silence. Kenneth asked some people to check the CCTV. At this time, Grace and the dean also rushed backstage. "Anne!" Grace rushed over. "What happened to your violin?" Anne didn't want to say much and just leaned to the side, exhausted. She didn't want to talk to Grace and didn't say it was Bessy. She wasn't sure if Grace would defend Bessy now that she knew about her relationship with Mr. Gomez. She just said lightly, "Someone deliberately cut my violin's string." Grace's chest heaved in anger and she turned directly to the dean. "Director Moore, how could you have such vile students in your school? Please be sure to find the culprit behind this." Director Moore glanced at the violin strings. It had indeed been cut by a sharp weapon. Anne was from the Smith family and Grace was also present, so this matter must be handled properly. He frowned and looked at Kenneth.
Mr. White, have you sent someone to check the CCTV?
I have. Kenneth recovered from his thoughts and drawled. Director Moore nodded and said nothing, but he was quite distant from Kenneth, even in his speech. However, Grace and Anne didn't realize it. Anne's performance was right after Mary's, so Bessy received Paul's call shortly after she left the auditorium. Her violin strings were cut? Bessy raised an eyebrow and stood in the shade for a while. She smiled in surprise. Unexpectedly, someone actually saw through her mask? Paul snorted.
Who knows, but she suspects you now.
At this, Paul paused. He didn't know what Kenneth was thinking. Even if he liked Anne, didn't he know what kind of person Bessy was? She thinks it was me? Bessy lowered her eyes. Paul responded.
Who knows what she's thinking? Anne is going to confront you backstage later. Oh yes, come with whoever you were with later.
Paul knew that this matter wouldn't be clarified. Given Anne's skills, she could really splash dirty water on Bessy and frame her. Bessy massaged her eyebrows. She put the cap on her head again. Then she took out her phone and called Michael again. Wait for me for another 10 minutes. Bessy estimated the time and then looked at the auditorium. I have matters to attend to. At the intersection, there was a black car with a Volkswagen logo. Michael hung up the phone and then threw the phone aside. He glanced at the time and saw it was 5 o'clock. He placed his other hand on his knee and knocked on it with his long fingers distractedly. Samuel looked over from the passenger seat and smiled.
Michael, what happened to Bessy? She has something to do and asked us to wait a little longer.
Michael leaned on the window and said lazily,
Okay.
Samuel nodded. He took out his phone and called Captain Gomez.
Then we'll wait.
Marvin didn't speak. Aside from Bessy, he really couldn't find another person in Evanston who could make the two guys wait. Episode 68. Can you recover? Paul was waiting for Bessy at the door. He was relieved to see that she wasn't in a bad mood, but his spirits weren't completely lifted. Paul entered the dressing room with Bessy. The people in the dressing room had been dismissed by Director Moore. Only a few leaders, Kenneth and Anne, were left. Paul came in with Bessy. Everyone looked over. Grace also raised her head subconsciously and stared at them. Before she turned to Bessy and asked curiously,
Bessy, why are you here?
Anne had always attached great importance to her surrounding relationships. Nobody else in the school except Paul and Kenneth knew that Bessy was her sister. Nobody knew Susan was her cousin. The baby face next to Anne said angrily when she saw Bessy, Bessy, why did you cut Anne's violin strings? Grace also heard the baby face and was stunned. She couldn't react and stared at Bessy in shock.
Bessy, you cut Anne's violin strings?
Although her tone seemed to be questioning, her face suggested otherwise. Nobody in the dressing room knew that the Twitter incident was related to Bessy, but Grace knew. She stared at Bessy and her lips twitched. Bessy squeezed her fingers and her fingertips were cold. She stared at the teachers and the dean in the room and took off her cap. She ignored Grace and said politely to Director Moore and the others, I'm not that bored. I think I remember that there is a surveillance camera in the corridor. You can check. Her tone was very stable and she wasn't angry nor panicked. She talked unhurriedly and was no different from her usual image. She held the cap in one hand and her delicate eyebrows were still cold. Bessy, I admit that you hate me, but why did you have to do it now? Does it make you happy to see the entire school mock me? Are you very proud now? Anne's eyes were red and her hands were shaking. She walked in front of Bessy and, without thinking, she reached out to slap her in resentment. How could she let Bessy be? She took a step back and turned to the side. Paul, Kenneth, and Director Moore all reached out almost at the same time to stop Anne. Kenneth looked fixedly at Anne.
I've already asked people to look at the CCTV.
Anne pursed her lips. You don't believe me. Paul had long been biased towards Bessy. Anne could endure this, but she didn't expect that Kenneth, who had always been on her side, wouldn't believe her. The dean as well. The three of them, with the most say in the dressing room, seemed to be on Bessy's side. Their subconscious attitude was like an invisible slap to Anne. Kenneth's eyes were lowered and his eyes were cold.
It won't be too late to wait until the CCTV results are out.
Director Moore stood aside and didn't speak. He just glanced at Bessy and remembered she was the girl who had snatched the limelight during the last speech. He had been very impressed that day. Thus, he also remembered that Anne had deliberately told him that Bessy had lost her script before the latter even began her speech. He had been the dean for many years and naturally understood the little tricks that these girls played. He also knew that Anne's mind wasn't so pure. So, he had stopped her before Anne could slap Bessy. At the same time, at the intersection by the school, Michael's half-narrowed eyes suddenly opened. He picked up his phone and looked at it. It was past 5:20. He lowered the car window and looked at the intersection. There were a lot of students crossing the road. No matter where she was, Bessy would exude a special aura and could be seen with one sweep across the crowd. But he didn't see her. Michael took his phone and opened the car door to get out. Marvin always followed Michael and also put his hand on the door when he saw him get out.
Hey!
Samuel was playing a game when he saw that Marvin also wanted to get out. He couldn't help but raise an eyebrow.
Think about it. Do you think Michael wants you to join him?
Marvin was speechless. He lowered his hand and sat down expressionlessly. Samuel crossed his legs and started another game. He looked up and saw a short-haired girl walking slowly by the roadside. Her head was lowered and she was wearing glasses, exuding a very dull impression. Samuel was stunned. He touched his ear studs subconsciously and then handed his phone to Marvin.
Help me play this game.
In the dressing room of the auditorium, several people retrieved the surveillance footage and came back.
Director Moore, the video was deliberately destroyed.
A teacher handed the computer to Director Moore.
It captured nothing.
In other words, it was impossible to find out the person who had destroyed Anne's violin. The matter seemed to be at a dead end now. Anne stared at Bessy and sneered. You should have known that the surveillance cameras couldn't be used from the beginning, right? You're so smart. Wouldn't you know to destroy the cameras in advance? Director Moore frowned.
There's no evidence. Anne, please don't speak without evidence.
Grace stared deeply at Bessy and seemed a little tired. She didn't know what to say and just whispered, Director Moore, my apologies. This is our family's matter and there is a little trouble between my children. I've really troubled you. She had excused Bessy in her words, but had also hammered shame on Bessy. Furthermore, she knew that Bessy didn't forgive Anne at all about the Twitter incident from last time. It wasn't entirely impossible for Bessy to be resentful. Mom! Anne was obviously dissatisfied with this solution. Bessy lowered her head and wrapped her fingers around her cap. There weren't many people in the dressing room, and it wasn't that noisy outside. But in Bessy's mind, it was like someone was stirring her brain with a wooden stick as if cooking pasta. The string that had been tight in her mind suddenly snapped. Bessy raised her head and licked her lips. Then she looked at Anne and Grace. Am I very close to you? She was used to using her hands and speaking coarsely. She was often hot-headed and would roll up her sleeves and settle the problem directly. But today, her logic hadn't disappeared completely. She seemed to hear a voice at the side and lowered her head lazily, like a crumbling star with a little bit of unclear tenderness. What's the matter? The door was pushed open and you could see a black flat shirt cuff. The man had slender fingers that shone like jade and were extremely defined. Looking up, his eyes were like a vast, starry sky. Even Anne was stunned by him. In the dressing room, the only person who knew Michael was Kenneth. He looked at Michael in disbelief and didn't expect him to come here. If Anne had looked at Kenneth, she would definitely have reacted, for Kenneth rarely lost his composure. Even Director Moore was stunned. He didn't know Michael's identity, but he had been secretly advised by Principal White several times not to touch the people in the school doctor's office. To avoid trouble, Principal White had even shown Director Moore the pictures of the people in the school doctor's office. As for Grace, she recognized that it was the person who had threatened her in the hospital, so she took a few fearful steps back subconsciously. Michael rarely paid attention to other people. His gaze fell on Bessy's face and his eyebrows wrinkled slightly as he walked towards her. Bessy gradually returned back to her senses at his familiar cold fragrance. Michael didn't look at her as his eyes fell on Kenneth, his only acquaintance in the room. Kenneth recovered and returned to his senses. He didn't dare to look at Michael, lowered his head slightly and explained the situation. Michael's ability to control the atmosphere was very strong. Nobody in the room knew him, but they couldn't help but follow his orders. He lowered his head and looked at the computer on the table and pressed the charger with his fingertips.
You're saying the surveillance data was destroyed?
Kenneth and Director Moore nodded. Michael reached out and knocked on the computer, then pointed at the table and asked Bessy,
Can you restore the data?
The people in the dressing room had yet to react to Michael. Bessy returned to her senses and put on her peak cap again. She cleared her throat and then said, As long as it existed before, I can find it. Michael glanced at her and nodded. Then he turned and let her sit down.
Watch your hand.
I know. Bessy sat down on a stool and started to restore the data. Anne finally reacted. Bessy, are you going to destroy the evidence completely? She took a step forward, but before she could even touch Bessy, a cold comb blocked her. Looking up, she saw a lazy face. Michael glanced at her lazily and said calmly,
Miss, please don't disturb her.
Anne glanced at him and opened her mouth, but no words came out. Michael turned over and threw the comb on the table without even looking at her. The people in the dressing room had yet to react so fast. But when Bessy started to input a series of characters smoothly, they were all attracted by her hands. When Bessy did programming, it was a feast for the eyes. Data popped up one after another, and she didn't even look at the keyboard. Her hands flew quickly. Grace didn't know what Bessy was doing at first, but when Bessy's hand touched the keyboard and her lazy posture suddenly turned serious, Grace froze subconsciously. Other than Paul, Kenneth, and the others who didn't understand the database in the least bit, even Grace and the babyface, who knew nothing, forgot to respond. They just stared blankly at Bessy as she pressed the characters one by one. Within 20 minutes, Bessy recovered the surveillance videos. She turned the computer to one side and raised an eyebrow at Michael. It's recovered. Michael had already seen her extraordinary talent before, so he wasn't surprised. He handed the computer to Director Moore and said,
Take a look.
The people in the room were still in a trance. They had yet to react. Director Moore also froze for a while before taking over the computer. Especially Anne. In her eyes, Bessy was talentless, and her grades were basically at the bottom. She didn't believe that Bessy knew how to program at all. Director Moore didn't speak and just opened the video that Bessy had recovered. The video turned on. It was a gray surveillance video. Episode 69. Mr. Clark Wants to See You. After zooming in, everyone in the room could see the clear figure on the computer monitor. A girl with a utility knife in her hand cut Anne's violin strings carefully. In less than a minute, the girl turned her head. Her profile could be seen very clearly on the computer screen. Paul said in shock,
Abigail, how could it be her?
The other people in the room didn't know Abigail, but they could see that the person wasn't Bessy. Hence, they needn't speak further about the truth.
So it really wasn't Bessy.
Director Moore found his voice and said dryly. Nobody responded. Paul and Grace looked over from the computer at Bessy. Grace was especially shocked, as she had never imagined that Bessy could recover the data. She looked at Bessy, her pupils contracting slightly. Finally, she was dazed and shocked. It was as if she had seen a ghost. Paul closed his mouth and raised his hand mechanically, saying nothing. Anne felt the gaze of others looking at Bessy. She didn't expect the person who had cut the strings wasn't Bessy, nor did she expect her to restore the data. She actually hid such a hand. The atmosphere was dull and stuffy. Bessy pinched Michael's sleeves before whispering, "Let's go." Michael lowered his head and looked at the two thin, white fingers clutching his sleeves. From this angle, he could only see her dark brim cap and her slightly pursed lips. Michael had lectured Bessy's mother before. Bessy's eyes had been red when he came. He didn't need to imagine what kind of scene Bessy had faced before he came. Michael didn't leave. His eyes swept across the people in the dressing room and he said very politely,
"So don't you need to apologize? There are so many people here and yet you slandered the girl casually without a single piece of evidence. Aren't you impressed?"
He said this sentence lightly, but Director Moore and Kenneth were terrified. The two of them immediately apologized to Bessy. It was only right that they apologized. By bringing a little girl to the dressing room without second words, it seemed like they had been bullies. Kenneth apologized and couldn't help but glance at Bessy. He didn't expect Michael to know Bessy and for them to be so close. It was fine that they knew each other, but he was even protecting her. Anne hadn't reacted yet, and she didn't even expect it was Abigail who had cut her strings. Michael took Bessy away. Before he left, he glanced sideways at Anne. Samuel didn't say much to Scarlett. It was mainly Samuel talking, and Scarlett didn't say a word from beginning to end. The car stopped at the intersection. Michael stopped on the side and didn't go in. He lifted his chin in the car's direction and motioned for Bessy to go in. Bessy crept out of the car. When she got into the car, Michael took out his phone and called someone. The phone rang once and was picked up. Michael put his hand in his pocket and looked at the crowd in the distance before saying casually,
"Principal White, I need you to help me find someone."
As he spoke, inconspicuous anger flickered across his lazy eyes. After he made the call, he put his phone back. Then he walked towards the car calmly. Samuel put his hand on the back of his seat and tilted his head to smile at Bessy with a raised eyebrow.
"Bessy, what did you do? Why did you come so late?"
Michael opened the door on the right and heard Samuel saying this. He looked up and said in a dull voice,
"Samuel."
"Yeah?" Samuel responded.
"Don't talk so much. Let me rest."
Michael sat down firmly, closed his eyes and said lazily. Samuel said nothing. The car drove slowly outside. The place Captain Gomez had chosen wasn't a club or private restaurant, but at the familiar Hotel Kennedy Grand. Michael was very controlling of Bessy's diet. But today, he broke the rule and ordered a boiled meat dish that Captain Gomez had ordered only for him to remove last time. Bessy sat beside Michael and Captain Gomez was on her other side. She held her fork in her hand and lowered her head. She inadvertently poked her plate with her fork, and her black hair slid across her brow bone. Her eyes as cold as usual. Bessy looked dispirited and didn't sit up until the server brought the boiled meat dish over to her. Samuel and the others sat down to eat. After so many days, they were pretty close.
"Captain Gomez, how did you know Bessy?"
Samuel wasn't interested in the dishes. He held his fork and looked at Captain Gomez without eating. Both Marvin and Harvey listened intently. Captain Gomez looked at Samuel, thought for a while and then said,
"I knew her from a case."
Samuel's eyes lit up.
"What case?"
Captain Gomez didn't speak and just lowered his head to eat. Damn it, he turned into that cold Captain Gomez again.
"Fine, then let's talk about Poison Wolf."
Samuel leaned back in his chair, a little bored.
"Harvey, have you found his hideout?"
Harvey shook his head.
"No, we went to 3 locations, but they moved away in advance."
They chatted amongst themselves. Marvin didn't dare speak and sent a tweet to Harvey.
"Did you find that Captain Gomez seems to respect Miss Miller very much?"
Harvey responded,
"A little."
Marvin sent another message.
"Don't you find it strange? Captain Gomez has first-class merit and his ability is obvious to all. The superiors even wanted to transfer him to Evanston several times. Although Miss Miller's computing skills are impressive, does it really render him like this?"
Harvey responded.
That's why Samuel asked, but Captain Gomez's lips are sealed.
After dinner, it was almost 8 o'clock. Bessy returned to class for self-study. Michael picked up a phone call and didn't return to the school clinic. Marvin saw Michael's cold eyes and couldn't help but shiver. The Smith family's house. Anne embarrassed herself today and came back in a depressed mood. She didn't dare to tell Thomas and David. She was afraid that they would be disappointed and afraid that they would find out Bessy had restored the surveillance video. God knew how shocked she had been when she saw Bessy restoring the surveillance video.
Anne, are you okay?
David and Thomas were discussing the Chicago development zone when they saw Anne. She was holding her mobile phone silently, as if in a daze. Anne returned to her senses and blurted out, "I was just thinking about finding Mr. Grint." David smiled gently and comforted her.
It's all right. There are still a few days left. There's no need to be nervous.
Aunt Ruth came in and said,
Master, there's a gentleman called Mr. Clark outside who wants to see you. His surname is Clark?
David didn't have an impression of who that could be, but he still said,
Tell him to come in.
Many people came to find David usually, so Anne and Thomas weren't surprised. Until they saw a cold-faced young man come in.
Mr. Smith, our boss said that this is the person you wanted.
Marvin's face was stiff as he loosened the woman behind him and nodded to David and the others.
Since she is here, I will take my leave first.
David glanced at her. She was a girl about the same age as Anne. He stood up immediately, frowned, and said solemnly,
Sir, did you make a mistake?
But before David could finish speaking, Anne stood up suddenly opposite him and said, Abigail, why did you cut my violin strings? Was I not good to you? Anne stared at Abigail, trying not to show coldness and anger on her face. She pinched her fingers and forced herself to calm down. Abigail just sneered at Anne and said nothing.
Violin strings?
David paused and then asked warmly,
Anne, your violin strings are broken?
Thomas noticed something strange. He took a piece of tissue to wipe the corners of his mouth, his eyes signaling for Anne to explain herself. Anne's eyes were red. She didn't even dare to go to school for self-study at night because she was afraid of people mocking her or judging her. She cut my violin strings during today's school celebration and ruined my performance, Anne said in a choked voice. David had specially customized Anne's violin for her, and it was of great value. This amount of money was nothing to David, however. He held a cigarette in his hand and turned toward Abigail seriously.
Abigail, right? Why did you cut my daughter's violin strings?
Abigail didn't speak. David flicked his cigarette into the ashtray and looked up again.
You should know that Anne's violin was customized. If you deliberately cut it, you will have to pay $5,800.
Anne stared at Abigail in sadness and disbelief. I also want to know. You want to know? Fine. Abigail heard about the $5,800 and raised her eyebrow. Anne, I want to know more about why you secretly took a picture of that middle-aged man and Bessy and then induced me to post it on the forum. Why do I have to be expelled from school and yet you're safe? The entire Smith family fell into a strange silence. What nonsense are you talking about? What picture did I take? Anne's pupils shrank. Abigail's reaction was completely out of her control. Thomas crumpled the tissues in his hands and threw them in the trash can at his feet. He raised his head slowly and looked at Anne.
You took the picture?
It wasn't me. Anne was flustered. Dad, brother, you must believe me. You gave me your phone and clicked onto the picture intentionally. Wasn't it just to show it to me on purpose? Abigail was unhurried. She took out her phone, opened the photo, and showed it to David. Anne stared at Abigail's phone. David didn't speak and just looked. Abigail had used her mobile phone to take a picture of Anne's phone. David had picked Anne's phone, and it was a limited edition phone that was rare in Brightbow High School, so he recognized it at first glance. David was shocked when he returned the phone silently to Anne and then looked at Aunt Ruth.
Send Abigail back.
Thomas hadn't looked at Abigail's phone, but he could tell the result from David's expression. Now that things had gotten to this, Anne closed her eyes and no longer had any excuses. Dad, if you want to believe them and think it was me, then it was me. Anne's face was pale, and her eyes were closed. She wasn't crying, and just spoke tiredly.
Let me think about it.
David walked upstairs. In the study, David called Grace first. Grace had been a little absent-minded at the dinner table today and was still in a trance when David called her. She hadn't recovered from the incident in the afternoon. Grace had paid little attention to Bessy since she was younger, and naturally didn't know that she could repair the surveillance videos. To Grace, this was a very impressive and high-tech skill. When David asked her, she told him what happened intermittently.
She recovered the monitoring video?
David was stunned.
She studied computers before?
Episode 70. Who did you tell me to learn the violin from?
Maybe.
Grace thought of something.
My dad, or Bessy's grandpa, was an old programmer. Maybe she learned it from him. I understand.
David nodded and pressed his temple tiredly. Then he told Grace to go out. After a long while, he dialed Elise's phone. He told her about the whole incident. Who is that Mr. Clark? There is a flourishing aristocrat in Evanston. Elise stood in her back garden and subconsciously thought of the Clark family in Evanston, but she smiled. But those people naturally wouldn't go to Chicago. Forget about it, brother. Now is not the time to do this. David was silent. Make a choice. Elise had a terrible impression of Bessy from the last time she was there. The person called Marvin must have been planted by Bessy. That little girl is scheming even though she's young and has put these in front of you. But she's still young and can't leave a retreat route for herself. Anne was a member of the Smith family, and she was the only one helping her financially in Evanston. As long as Mr. Grint took a fancy to her, there would be infinite possibilities for them in the future. On the contrary, Elise knew that Bessy's grades weren't good, and she wasn't good at the violin either. She only had a good-looking face, and her future wasn't comparable to Anne's, so her background couldn't possibly be good. If Bessy was smart enough, she should have taken advantage of this time to build a good relationship with the Smith family and Anne. Elise didn't really want to know about Bessy and just said, "Didn't Anne say that Bessy also learned the violin? I already asked my husband, but Mr. Grint will never accept a disciple like Bessy. But it's still possible to find other violin teachers for her. You have to let Bessy learn properly from Anne these few days, though. Those teachers don't just accept any random country girl." Not far from the Smith family. When Marvin came back, Samuel was standing by the car, his face somber as he kicked the car fiercely. He glanced at Michael inside the car.
Why did you send her to the Smith family? Aren't you suppressing them?
In the beginning, Samuel didn't know that Michael had asked Principal White to find someone for Bessy. But when Marvin had gone to the Smith's house, he had gotten the truth out of Michael's mouth. He had also learned about Bessy's incident in the auditorium in the afternoon. With his protective instincts towards Bessy, he really wanted to go back in time, go to the makeup room and kill all the people inside.
That's not a long-term plan.
Michael didn't get out of his car and just left the back door open. He leaned on the back of his chair, letting the breeze blow past him as he said slowly,
"They have to make a choice first."
Michael had never checked on Bessy, but he could guess that her stepfather and stepbrother weren't bad people, but her mother and sister were really too bad. With Thomas and David entangled in the middle, it was difficult for Bessy to dismiss them. He was forcing the Smith family to choose one from the other. Michael didn't elaborate further, and Samuel had to spend 10 minutes before he understood. He finally turned to Michael silently.
"Michael, you're cruel."
Michael glanced at him and then looked away. He lowered his head slightly, opened the window, and took out a cigarette.
"Let's go."
The next day. It was the afternoon self-study time. Mr. Scott put his hands behind his back and walked in front of Bessy. He knocked on her table, pulled her to the corridor, and praised her with great admiration.
I heard from your physics teacher that your results are nearly 40 points. You have made significant progress.
Mr. Scott's eyes were bright and his tone was very kind.
There are still 7 months left until the college entrance examination. I believe that you'll be able to get into a university.
Mrs. Lewis passed by with her lesson plan and felt too lazy to even ridicule her. 40 points were even worthy of praise? She looked at Mr. Scott with a smile. Mr. Scott, I think you should look at how your class average has fallen. Don't get the last place during the midterm exam. After that, Mrs. Lewis turned and walked away on her high heels, without waiting for Mr. Scott's answer. She couldn't help but feel fortunate that she had withstood the pressure of the principal back then. Otherwise, she wouldn't be getting any year-end awards or the Outstanding Teacher of the Year award. Mr. Scott was still smiling. He was a little plump and always gave people a gentle and warm feeling. Mrs. Lewis's words did not bother him.
Okay, just keep this mentality and work harder next time. Go and rest. Your uncle is looking for you.
Mr. Scott waved. He let Bessy go to the office. Bessy glanced at Mr. Scott.
What's wrong?
Mr. Scott noticed her gaze and asked, still smiling.
Do you have anything to ask me?
No, thank you, teacher. Bessy shook her head and answered slowly. She walked in the lounge's direction. Before she went in, she thought it would be Mayor Grant or Captain Gomez, or someone else who found her, but she never thought it would be David. Uncle Smith. Bessy went in and closed the door. She turned sideways and wasn't as cold as before. She was wearing her school jacket properly today, with her black pants underneath, making her look quite obedient. David stared at her and paused before he said warmly,
I came to find you today to apologize to you and talk to you about something else.
Bessy respected David, so she pushed a chair over and let David sit. Yes?
I want you to know, if you still want to learn the violin, your mother said that you had also learned the violin and that you're talented in it.
David thought for a moment and continued,
I want to send you to Evanston to learn the violin. The teachers in Evanston have stricter requirements, but as long as you're willing to learn, you can go for the assessment. Of course, I will let Anne teach you for a few days if you want. I heard that Mr. Grint has taken a fancy to her music.
Wait. Bessy suspected that she had misheard. She touched her ear and stood up straight. Uncle Smith, what did you say? I didn't hear it. What had David just said? Did he just tell her to learn the violin from Anne? David repeated himself. He saw the girl in front of him become silent for a moment. David thought about it for a while. What was with Bessy's expression just now when he mentioned the violin? Bessy returned to her senses a minute later and said emotionlessly, There's no need. Anne had still been potty training when she started playing the violin. David looked up at Bessy and seemed surprised by her choice. It was a surprise he hadn't expected.
Then I heard from your mom that you have a bit of knowledge about computers. The Smith family also has several computer industries. You can come to our company to explore.
David proposed again. Thank you, Uncle, but there's no need. Bessy rejected him again.
You don't have to hurry to reject me. This is a good choice for you.
David's expression was a little complicated, and he paused for a few seconds.
I will give you a few days. If you change your mind, call me.
Then David took out his business card and handed it to Bessy. Bessy looked down and reached out to take it slowly. David usually spoke well in the business field, but now he looked at the girl with her hand in her pocket and half lowered his eyes. The girl was trying to keep a distance from him, and he couldn't find a topic to talk about. He took his phone and went downstairs. Downstairs, Mrs. Lewis, who had been standing by the windows watching the situation, saw David coming down and squinted slightly, thinking that he seemed very familiar. Bessy returned to English class and found that class was almost over. Paul had changed seats with the classmates in front of her. When she came back, he leaned sideways and said in a low voice,
What did boss ask you to do?
Bessy raised her hand and dropped the business card on the table, then leaned against the wall lazily. He encouraged me to study hard. At the thought of Bessy's results, Paul stifled a laugh.
He actually told you to study hard?
He suddenly found it interesting and stopped talking to the person in front of him. Then he asked if Mr. Scott had said anything, curiously. After talking for a while, he saw the business card that Bessy had thrown aside. Paul picked it up and looked at it for a moment, shocked.
David came to find you?
Yeah. Bessy slowly took her book out from under her table.
Why?
Bessy told him briefly.
Wait, you've learned the violin before?
Paul was stunned.
Why haven't I heard you say that you know how to play the violin, nor seen you play it before?
I learned it when I was a kid. Bessy supported her chin and said in low spirits. Paul automatically interpreted this to mean that she wasn't good at the violin, which was a normal reaction for humans. It was because she had never mentioned it before, and if she had learned it well, she would have said something.
Then why didn't you promise him?
Paul laid his hands on the table, took the English book, and covered the side of his face with it.
Actually, what Uncle David said makes a lot of sense. It's much better than you finding a job elsewhere. Uncle David has already made some concessions so that you can repair your relationship with the Smith family.
After a pause, Paul continued to say,
Furthermore, what will you do in the future if you reject him? The Smith family is pretty big in Chicago. Don't you think that Uncle David will think that you don't know what's for your own good if you do this?
Paul's concerns and doubts also made sense. Bessy was now David's stepdaughter, but in reality, she simply couldn't compare to Anne. Anne had grown up in the Smith family, and they were naturally biased towards her. With the Smith family's guidance in Chicago, it was clear that their life would be good, especially for people like Bessy, who had no background. David's 2 proposals had been made from the perspective of Bessy, and Paul didn't see any harm to it. Bessy didn't know that Paul had thought so much. She just reached out to turn her book, glanced at Paul and smiled slowly. Who told you that I would stay in Chicago and rely on the Smith family? Paul froze, and his heart jumped. He seemed to have noticed something and asked,
Wait, what did you say?